So, what do the opium wars of the 1800s have to do with the fentanyl crisis in the West today, Russ? Well, let's dive in and take a closer look, shan't we? We shan't. The 1800s was a time when China enjoyed a gratified trade surplus with Europe, which included luxuries such as porcelain, tea, and of course, silk in exchange for silver. However, in the late 1800s, in order to offset the deficit and realizing the growing popularity in smoking what was originally used as an anesthetic in China, the British began to export opium under the radar. Not an entirely moral strategy. Miraculously or not, this would lead China into a widespread addiction epidemic and a slew of social problems within its culture. You don't say. In the attempt to rehabilitate the citizens of China, the Qing government would try to completely ban the opium trade. However, this would cause a multitude of clashes with British merchants, like the East India Company that American colonists had beef with 100 years prior. Needless to say, the beef got strong in China, and this would eventually lead to the first of two opium wars. And with capitalism on their backs, American merchants would also jump into the industry, smuggling opium in from Turkey. By 1833, this would amount to a ballpark of around 2,300 tons per year. As the opium epidemic matured, the emperor would order a halt to all opium trade and emphasize harsh penalties on anyone willing to violate the now illegal endeavor. Following it up with the seizure of all opium, as well as the forced shutdown and blockade at all ports of entry, the chief superintendent of trade for Britain then handed over 20,000 chests full of opium to the governor general to be destroyed. But alas, the British government would say, "Hell no!" and employ its military might in the form of the Royal Navy into the South China Sea, and in 1840 bombard the port of Dinghai, resulting in a series of embarrassing defeats on Chinese forces. As China took the L, they would eventually sign the first of obvious unequal treaties with Britain, forcing them to give up Hong Kong, allowing even more ports to Western traders, and paying $21 million in reparations. Britain would also become exempt from any Chinese laws. In the aftermath of a later rebellion, North China would establish a new capital and imperial commissioner, whose goal it was to stamp out the opium trade once and for all, seizing a British ship and throwing its crew in chains. Once again, this would call for British military intervention, and due to a French missionary being killed amidst a riot, France was now backing the UK along with the US. A full Western trifecta. After a second L, China would have to sign yet another treaty paying more reparations, with more open ports, and completely legalize opium altogether. This is now known as the Century of Humiliation in Chinese history, due to the loss of total control over so many of its territories to its enemies. Fast forward to 2025 and oh my, how the turntables. I can only imagine the PTSD China carried with it from the Century of Humiliation, but it appears instead of hiding in a closet, rocking itself back and forth, China prefers to play the long game. And gets even? On the US DEA government website, the unclassified documents clearly states that China remains the primary source of fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances trafficked into the United States. And China seems to have contracted the Mexican cartels while supplying them with all ingredients necessary to produce the incredibly deadly drug and traffic it into the US. They don't necessarily strike me as a country that neither forgives nor forgets. Could this be China forcing the West to pay reparations this time? Another interesting part of this entire operation is that our civil servants in Washington continue to do biz per usual with China, while they play possibly the most significant role in the flooding of fentanyl into this country. In this scenario, anyway, one could say that possibly Payback is indeed a bitch.